In the autumn of 1886, on a flat and unforgiving stretch of land in Pembina County, North Dakota, the settlers prepared for winter with the grim determination of soldiers digging trenches for a battle they knew was inevitable. The work was a familiar ritual, a litany of tasks repeated across the prairie. Men sharpened their axes, their breath fogging in the crisp air as they felled the sparse cottonwoods and oaks that clung to the banks of the Red River. They split and stacked the wood in towering cords that stood like sentinels against the coming cold. Their cabins, built of hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, were monuments to a hard-won but conventional wisdom. They were simple, stout boxes with high-peaked roofs designed to shed snow and cavernous stone fireplaces designed to swallow enormous logs and roar defiance at the wind. Amidst this flurry of standardized preparation, one man's labor was a source of constant curiosity, which soon curdled into ridicule. His name was Lin Jian, a quiet, almost invisible man who had arrived a year earlier after his contract with the Northern Pacific Railway had expired. While his neighbors raised their woodpiles, he spent his days hauling field stones and mixing clay with sand and river straw in a meticulous, almost ceremonial fashion. His cabin was smaller than the others, with a ceiling so low a tall man would have to stoop, but it was the structure he was building inside that drew the most scorn. It was not a fireplace. It was a long, low, serpentine platform of brick and stone that snaked its way across nearly the entire length of the cabin's main room. It stood no more than 2 feet high, a massive waist-level bench connected at one end to a small cast-iron box, and at the other to a narrow stovepipe that exited through the wall. Thomas Abernathy, a man whose voice was as broad as his shoulders and who served as the settlement's unofficial arbiter of common sense, would often stop by, a smirk playing on his lips. "Still building your stone bed, Jin?" he would boom, loud enough for others to hear. "You'll be sleeping mighty hard on that thing." The other men would laugh. They called it Jian's folly. They called it the dragon's couch. They called it a wasteful, foolish thing. "Heat rises, man," Abernathy would explain with the tired patience of a schoolmaster. "You're building a chimney that's fallen over. All you're doing is warming the floorboards for the mice." Lin Jian would simply nod, offering a faint, polite smile, and continue his work, tamping the clay mixture around the intricate brick channels he had laid. He did not argue. He did not defend his methods. He simply worked, his movements precise and unhurried. He was building a kang, a heated bed stove common in the frigid northern lands of his ancestral home, a technology perfected over centuries of brutal winters. But to the settlers of North Dakota, who equated a massive, roaring fire with survival, his small firebox and his enormous stone bench were the height of absurdity. They saw the space it consumed, the labor it required, and the sheer strangeness of its design, and they dismissed it. They called it wasteful. They called it foolish. But 2 years later, when the historic blizzard of January 1888 descended upon the plains, a storm so sudden and violent it would be forever known as the schoolchildren's blizzard, the laughter died, frozen in the throats of men who watched their own roaring fires fail. As temperatures plunged to 40 below zero and winds shrieked with the force of a hurricane, the conventional wisdom of the frontier cabin was tested and found fatally wanting. The log walls leaked heat like sieves. The great fireplaces devoured fuel and returned only smoke and drafts, and families huddled on the brink of freezing to death just feet from a blazing hearth. In the midst of that white hell, Lin Jian's small cabin became an island of impossible warmth, a testament to a different kind of wisdom. What did this quiet immigrant, with his strange, low-slung stove, understand about the fundamental physics of heat, mass, and air that everyone else, in their confident expertise, had dismissed as a fool's errand? Lin Jian was not from the frozen north of China, as many of the settlers assumed. His knowledge was not born of a lifetime spent in a similar climate. He hailed from Guangdong, a subtropical province in the south where the greatest climatic threat was a typhoon, not a blizzard. His education in the art of winter survival had been earned much closer to home, on the very plains where he now lived. He had come to America as a young man, part of the immense labor force that laid the iron spine of the Northern Pacific Railway across the continent. It was there, in the flimsy, draft-ridden bunkhouses of the railroad crews, that he received his first brutal lesson in the failures of American construction. He watched his fellow workers, strong men hardened by years of labor, sicken and sometimes die during the Dakota winters. They would feed the pot-bellied stoves until they glowed cherry red, but the heat would rise immediately to the high ceilings, leaving the men sleeping in their bunks just a few feet away, shivering in air that was often below freezing. The stoves consumed mountains of coal and wood, yet the bunkhouses were never truly warm. They were merely pockets of scorching heat surrounded by a vast, penetrating cold. He saw the inefficiency, the waste, the fundamental flaw in a system that threw immense energy at a problem without understanding its nature. The seed of the idea for his Kong was planted by an old man in his work crew, a Manchurian named Wu, whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles etched by the Siberian winds of his homeland. One night, huddled around a sputtering stove, Wu spoke of his home. He described a house where a single small fire, lit only twice a day, could keep the entire family warm through the night and into the next afternoon. He didn't speak of a fireplace, but of the Kang. He described it not as a stove, but as a part of the house itself, a raised platform of brick and clay that served as a bed, a table, and a workspace. He explained, with gestures more than words, how the smoke and hot gas from the cooking stove were not vented directly outside. Instead, they were channeled through a long, winding maze of flues running the length of the Kong before finally exiting through a chimney. "Long road for fire dragon," Wu had said, tracing a serpentine path in the air with his finger. "Dragon tired when he leaves all his warm breath behind." The concept was a revelation to Lin Jian. It was a complete inversion of the American method. The Americans sought to generate a massive amount of heat and throw it into the room, accepting that most of it would be lost. The Manchurian method sought to generate a modest amount of heat and capture every last bit of it before it could escape. It was a philosophy of conservation, not brute force. His understanding was deepened by quiet observation of the people who had lived on those plains for centuries. The Sioux. He noticed their earth lodges, semi-subterranean dwellings built into the prairie itself. He saw how the thick sod walls and earth-packed roofs did not fight the cold, but absorbed it, using the immense thermal stability of the ground to moderate the temperature within. Their fires were small, used for cooking and a bit of warmth, but the dwelling itself did the heavy lifting of insulation. The principle was the same as Wu's Kong. The power was not in the fire, but in the mass that surrounded it. These two streams of knowledge, the ancient technology of the Manchurian Kang and the time-tested wisdom of the Sioux Earth Lodge, merged in Lin Jian's mind. He began to understand the physics that his neighbors, for all their practical experience, had missed. He understood the profound difference between heating the air and heating the mass. Air is a fickle reservoir of warmth. It has a low specific heat, meaning it heats up quickly but also cools down just as fast. Heating the air in a drafty cabin was like trying to fill a leaky bucket. The effort was constant, and the losses were enormous. Mass, on the other hand, was a thermal battery. Dense materials like stone, brick, and clay have a high thermal mass. They absorb heat energy slowly, storing it deep within their structure, and then release it just as slowly over a very long period. Lin Jian realized that the roaring American fireplace was a spectacular failure of heat transfer. It relied almost entirely on radiant heat, the energy you feel when standing directly in front of the flames. But the moment you stepped away, the feeling vanished. The vast majority of the fire's energy, in the form of superheated gas and smoke, was convective heat, and it was shot straight up the chimney, completely wasted. His Kang was designed to capture that convective heat. By forcing the hot flue gases through a long, winding channel surrounded by tons of brick and clay, he was performing a massive heat exchange. The gases would cool significantly as their energy was absorbed by the masonry, and the mass would then radiate that captured warmth back into the room slowly and evenly for hours, long after the fire itself had died down. Furthermore, he understood the importance of efficient combustion. The large, open fireplaces of his neighbors were notoriously inefficient. The huge logs smoldered more than they burned, resulting in incomplete combustion that produced a great deal of smoke, creosote, and wasted fuel. Lin Jian's firebox was small and enclosed. This allowed him to use smaller pieces of wood, which would burn at a much higher temperature. This hot, fast burn resulted in far more complete combustion, extracting the maximum possible energy from every stick of wood and producing almost no smoke. It was a system of interlocking efficiencies, a holistic approach to warmth where every element was designed to conserve, capture, and control energy. While his neighbors saw a foolish stone bench, Lin Jian saw a perfectly engineered thermal battery. The construction began in the late summer, a solitary and methodical process that became a daily spectacle for the small community. Lin Jian first dug a shallow, rectangular trench down the center of his cabin's dirt floor, about a foot deep. Into this, he carefully laid a foundation of large, flat fieldstones, creating a solid base that would support the immense weight to come and isolate it from the ground moisture. This was the first point of confusion for onlookers. Abernathy, watching from the doorway, had declared, "A man builds his hearth up, not down. You're burying your fire." On top of this stone footing, the true artistry of the system began to take shape. Using precious bricks he had salvaged from a defunct railroad kiln, Lin Jian constructed the flue channels. It was not a straight pipe. He built a labyrinth, a serpentine path that doubled back on itself twice, forming a compressed S shape. Each turn was carefully calculated, the brickwork precise and tight, sealed with a mortar of clay and fine sand. This winding path was the core of his heat exchange engine. It was designed to maximize the residence time of the hot gases within the masonry mass, forcing them to travel nearly 30 feet before they could find the exit. The neighbors saw only a crooked, nonsensical tunnel. They couldn't comprehend that the length of the journey was the entire point. Once the brick channels were complete, he began to build up the mass around them. This was the slowest, most laborious part of the process. He mixed local clay, sand, and chopped river straw with water, creating a dense, heavy cob. He packed this mixture into every void, building up the walls of the platform, tamping it down firmly until the entire brick labyrinth was entombed within a solid, monolithic block of earth. Day after day, he worked, his hands and clothes caked in mud, his focus absolute. He was sculpting a mountain of thermal mass, a reservoir for warmth. Finally, he capped the entire structure. He used large, flat pieces of slate and flagstone he had painstakingly hauled from a distant quarry. He laid them over the top of the packed earth, fitting them together with tight clay joints until the surface was a smooth, dark, and slightly uneven plane that dominated the interior of his cabin. It was at once a bed, a bench, and a table. It was the warm heart of his home. At the head of this great stone beast, he installed his firebox, a small but sturdy cast iron affair with a tight-fitting door and a simple air intake vent. It was laughably small compared to the gaping maws of his neighbors' fireplaces. It looked like it could barely hold more than a few kindling sticks. At the far end of the platform, a single 6-inch stovepipe emerged from the masonry and elbowed out through the log wall. The entire apparatus was sealed, contained, and utterly alien. Thomas Abernathy was the most vocal critic, his arguments rooted in the seemingly unassailable logic of frontier experience. "It's a tomb, Gian," he pronounced one afternoon, gesturing at the finished kang. "You've taken up half your cabin to build a stone box that can't possibly work. Look at my hearth," he said, puffing out his chest and pointing back toward his own newly chinked cabin. "I can fit a 4-foot log in there. I can build a fire that'll hold back the devil himself. You," he said, poking a thick finger at Gian's tiny firebox, "you'll be feeding that little mouth with twigs all night long. And for what? To warm up a rock?" His arguments were echoed by the others. They were based on a visual and intuitive understanding of heat. A big fire was hot. A big fire meant survival. A high ceiling was necessary to allow the smoke and stale air to rise and clear, even if it meant a larger volume to heat. A chimney should go straight up through the roof, the most direct path for the smoke to escape. Every aspect of Lin Jian's design violated these principles. His firebox was tiny, his ceiling was low, his chimney ran sideways, and his fireplace was a cold, solid block of stone. They saw waste, a waste of space, a waste of brick, a waste of labor. Lin Jian, in his quiet way, persisted. He ignored the daily commentary and the well-intentioned but condescending advice. He focused on his own preparations, which were as unconventional as his stove. While his neighbors stacked massive cords of thick oak logs, he gathered willow and cottonwood, softer woods that the others often ignored. He cut them not into large rounds, but into small, split pieces no thicker than his wrist, and he stacked them neatly inside his cabin in a dry space beside the kang. When Abernathy scoffed at his pile of kindling, asking how he expected to last a week on that, Gian offered one of his rare verbal rebuttals, spoken in his careful, accented English. "Your fire eats logs," he said simply. "My fire sips sticks." He understood that his high-temperature firebox didn't need the long, slow burn of a massive log. It needed the quick, intense, and complete combustion of smaller fuel, a principle of efficiency that was lost on men accustomed to measuring their winter security by the sheer tonnage of their woodpile. His confidence was not born of arrogance, but of quiet calculation and a deep trust in the ancient wisdom he was painstakingly recreating thousands of miles from its origin. January 12th, 1888, dawned with a deceptive mildness. The temperature hovered just above freezing, and a light thaw softened the hard-packed snow. Children went to school in light jackets, and farmers, optimistic about the break in the weather, ventured out to tend to their livestock. But in the northwest, a meteorological bomb was exploding. A colossal mass of Arctic air, a polar vortex displaced from its usual domain, was plunging south with unprecedented speed. By mid-morning, the sky had turned a strange, ominous shade of gray, and the temperature began to drop, not by degrees, but by tens of degrees per hour. By early afternoon, the full fury of the storm struck. The world outside the cabin walls dissolved into a white, roaring chaos. The wind, a steady screaming gale of over 60 miles per hour, picked up the loose snow and blasted it horizontally across the plains. Visibility dropped to 0. The temperature plummeted to 20, then 30, then 40 degrees below 0. It was a cold that was not merely an absence of heat, but an active, malevolent force. The fine, sharp ice crystals driven by the wind worked their way through the tiniest cracks, stinging any exposed skin like 1,000 needles and finding every imperfection in the settlers' cabins. Inside Thomas Abernathy's cabin, the battle for survival began in earnest. His home, a symbol of frontier self-reliance, quickly became a freezing trap. The massive stone fireplace, his pride and joy, was now his greatest enemy. The immense volume of air it drew up the chimney to feed the flames created a powerful negative pressure inside the cabin, sucking the super-chilled Arctic air in through every chink in the log walls. The wind howled through the gaps, creating dozens of tiny invisible jets of frigid air that cut through the room's warmth. His wife, Mary, stuffed rags and moss into the cracks, but it was a futile effort. Abernathy fed log after log into the fire, which roared and crackled, a furnace of brilliant light and sound. Yet its heat was a lie. The radiant energy warmed a small semicircle directly in front of the hearth, but 6 feet away, the air was a pocket of deep cold. The family huddled together on the floor, wrapped in every blanket they owned, turning themselves like spits on a roast, first one side to the fire, then the other to the freezing room. The high ceiling he had been so proud of was now a vast reservoir of cold air pressing down on them. The heat from his fire rushed upwards and was immediately lost. His woodpile, stacked just outside the door, was now buried under a drift of snow that was already taller than he was. He realized with a surge of panic that retrieving more fuel would be a life-threatening expedition. Meanwhile, in Lin Jian's small, low-ceilinged cabin, the atmosphere was one of serene, unbelievable calm. He had lit a small fire in his firebox that morning when the first chill had entered the air. He had fed it a few armfuls of his small, split sticks, letting them burn hot and fast for about 2 hours. Then he had closed the airtight door of the firebox and let the fire die out. The work was already done. The immense thermal mass of the Kang had absorbed the intense burst of heat from that short, efficient fire. Now, it was releasing it. The entire 12-foot length of the stone and slate platform radiated a steady, gentle, pervasive warmth. It was not the scorching, directional heat of a fireplace, but a uniform, ambient heat that warmed the objects in the room, not just the air. There were no drafts, because his sealed firebox did not suck the cabin's air up a chimney. The low ceiling kept the warmth concentrated in the living space. The entire cabin was a pocket of stable, comfortable warmth. Lin Jian sat on a simple mat placed on the warm slate of the Kong, reading a book by the light of a small oil lamp. The howling of the wind outside was a distant, irrelevant sound. His home was not fighting the storm, it was ignoring it. The physics of his design had created a fortress of thermal stability that the brute force of the blizzard could not breach. Vindication, for Lin Jian, was not an emotional event, but a matter of empirical data. Tacked to the wall beside his small pantry was a simple mercury thermometer, a novelty he had purchased from a traveling salesman. Throughout the first night of the blizzard, as the wind shrieked and the world outside plunged into a state of lethal cold, he made periodic notes in a small, leather-bound ledger. At midnight, exterior temperature, an estimated -42 degrees Fahrenheit. Interior temperature, a steady 66 degrees. At 3 in the morning, with the fire in the Kang having been out for nearly 12 hours, interior temperature 64 degrees. He also noted his fuel consumption. To maintain this warmth, he had used a quantity of wood that would have amounted to little more than a single large log from Abernathy's pile. He was not merely surviving. He was living in comfort, using a fraction of the resources, his success measured in degrees and grams. On the second day, desperation set in across the settlement. Inside the Abernathy cabin, the situation had become critical. They had exhausted the small supply of wood they had kept indoors. Thomas had made one perilous journey to the woodpile, tying a rope around his waist, and had returned with his face and hands frostbitten, clutching a few frozen, snow-caked logs. They sputtered and smoked in the fireplace, producing more frustration than heat. The water in the bucket by the door was frozen solid. His young son, Daniel, was shivering uncontrollably, his lips tinged with blue, his responses sluggish. Mary looked at her husband, her eyes wide with a terror that cut through him deeper than the cold. They had begun to break apart a wooden crate for fuel. The next step would be the furniture. He knew they would not last another night. Swallowing a pride that now seemed a pointless and deadly vanity, Thomas Abernathy made his decision. He wrapped himself in his heaviest coat, pulled his hat down low, and tied the rope to his door handle once more. He told Mary he was going to check on Jian. He did not say he was going for help. The words would not form. He plunged into the blinding maelstrom, a ghost moving through a world of white noise and biting cold, following the faint outline of the fence he had built between their properties. He expected to find Lin Jian's cabin dark and frozen, its inhabitant another victim of the storm. He hammered on the door with a numb fist, shouting against the wind. The door swung open, and Abernathy was struck not by a wave of cold, but by a gentle, enveloping warmth that seemed to defy all laws of nature. It was not the heat of a fire. It was the heat of a summer stone. He saw Lin Jian, standing calmly in the soft lamplight, wearing simple trousers and a shirt. There was no fire visible, no roaring hearth, only a profound and impossible stillness. His gaze fell upon the thermometer on the wall, its mercury column standing proudly above 60 degrees. He looked at the massive stone platform he had mocked for months, and for the first time, he did not see a foolish bench. He saw the engine of survival. His own son was freezing to death less than 100 yards away, and here, in the fool's cabin, It was like a spring afternoon. Defeated and humbled, he looked at the quiet man before him. The arrogant pronouncements, the confident dismissals, all of it turned to ash in his mouth. He could only manage a single, whispered word. How? There was no triumph in Lin Jian's eyes, no hint of, I told you so. There was only a calm, quiet compassion. He gestured for Abernathy to enter, then pointed toward his cabin. Your family, he said. Bring them. He did not wait for an answer, already moving to pour hot tea from a kettle that sat on the warm surface of the kang. Abernathy, his face streaked with frozen tears, stumbled back into the storm. A few minutes later, the door opened again, and the Abernathy family fell into the warmth of Lin Jian's home. Jian helped settle the shivering boy and his mother onto a thick blanket on the surface of the kang. The steady, radiant heat from the stone below began to seep into their frozen bodies, a gentle and life-giving warmth that was more effective than any roaring fire. As they drank the hot, sweet tea, Thomas Abernathy, the loud, confident leader of the community, sat silently on the floor, watching his family being saved by the very thing he had ridiculed. He looked at Jian and asked again, his voice cracking, Please, how does this work? Lin Jian sat beside him, and with simple gestures, he explained. He pointed to the small firebox. Small, hot fire, here. Then his hand traced the long, serpentine path of the flues hidden inside the stone. Smoke travels, long road, leaves heat behind. He patted the warm slate. Heat stays here for many hours. It was the simple, elegant physics of survival. And in that moment, Abernathy understood. When the great blizzard finally broke after 3 days of relentless fury, the stories that emerged were of hardship, loss, and heroism. But in the small settlement in Pembina County, the most remarkable story was that of Lin Jian's survival and of his rescue of the Abernathy family. The tale spread from cabin to cabin, carried on the hushed tones of awe and respect. Thomas Abernathy, once the chief skeptic, now became Lin Jian's most fervent disciple. He was a changed man, his former arrogance replaced by a deep and genuine humility. He publicly admitted his folly, describing to his neighbors the profound, life-saving warmth he had experienced in Jian's cabin. He led a procession of homesteaders to Jian's home, not to mock, but to learn. They stood in the small, warm space, touching the surface of the kang in wonder. They peppered Jian with questions, their tone no longer condescending but deferential. With Abernathy acting as an eager interpreter, Lin Jian patiently explained the principles of his creation. He drew diagrams in the dirt floor with a stick, showing them the crucial S-curve of the flue that maximized heat exchange. He crumbled the clay and straw mixture in his hands, explaining how its density was key to storing the heat. He demonstrated the efficiency of the small firebox, showing them how quickly a handful of sticks could bring the system up to temperature. He was no longer Jian the fool, but Master Lin, the keeper of a powerful and mysterious knowledge. That summer, the sounds of construction in the settlement were different. Alongside the usual repairs and barn raisings, a half-dozen families, under the guidance of Lin Jian and the enthusiastic supervision of Thomas Abernathy, began retrofitting their own cabins. They tore out their massive, inefficient stone fireplaces, a move that would have been considered sacrilege just a year before. They hauled stone and mixed clay, building their own versions of the kang. Each one was slightly different, adapted to the layout of the cabin and the materials available. Abernathy built a large L-shaped version that could warm both the main room and a small bedroom. Another family with several young children built one with a broad, flat surface, perfect for sleeping. The innovation was not just copied, it was adapted and integrated into the lives of the community. The following winter served as the ultimate proof of concept. The results were immediate and dramatic. Thomas Abernathy kept a meticulous log, and in a report to the community, he announced that he had survived the winter, a typically harsh one, using less than 40% of the wood he had consumed the previous year. Yet, he declared, his family had never been warmer or more comfortable. The drafts were gone. The cold spots had vanished. The oppressive damp chill that had always permeated the cabin in the depths of winter was replaced by a steady, dry, pleasant warmth. These benefits cascaded through the community. The local school teacher, a thoughtful woman named Eleanor Evans, documented the changes in her journal. She noted a significant decline in the winter ailments, the coughs, fevers, and respiratory illnesses that had previously plagued the children. The improved living conditions were most noticeable among the most vulnerable. Infants who had struggled through previous winters now thrived. The elderly, who were often the first to succumb to the brutal cold, survived with a new robustness. The Kang, or the Chinese bed stove, as it came to be known, had done more than save fuel. It had fundamentally improved the health, security, and quality of life for the entire settlement. It was a revolution in a box of stone. The legacy of Lin Jian's innovation did not remain confined to the small Pembina County settlement. Eleanor Evans, the school teacher, who had meticulously observed the stove's impact, wrote a series of long, detailed letters to her brother, an engineer working for a manufacturing firm in Chicago. She described the design of the Kang in precise detail, including sketches of the flue layout and notes on the materials used. She enclosed copies of Thomas Abernathy's fuel consumption logs and her own observations on the community's improved health. Her brother, intrigued by the rustic genius of the design, condensed her letters into a technical article. He submitted it to the American Farmer, a popular journal of the day. The article, published under the title A Frontier Adaptation of the Manchurian Stove Bed, a study in thermal efficiency, described the system and its remarkable performance during the Great Blizzard of 1888. While it did not spark a nationwide building craze, the era of cheap coal and centralized heating was already dawning. It entered the official record. Lin Jian's practical wisdom was no longer just local lore. It was documented science. Decades later, the principles that Lin Jian had so expertly demonstrated would be rediscovered and validated by modern building science. His Chinese bed stove was in essence a highly sophisticated masonry heater, a device now prized by off-grid builders and energy conservationists. The small, hot-burning firebox and the long, convoluted flue path are the very core of the modern rocket mass heater, a design celebrated for its ability to burn wood cleanly and extract nearly all of its energy. Modern engineers, armed with computers and advanced thermodynamics, had arrived at the same conclusions as the ancient builders of Manchuria. Furthermore, the Kang stands as a direct ancestor to modern radiant floor heating. By using a large, heated mass to warm a living space from the floor up, Lin Jian was creating a far more comfortable and efficient thermal environment than any forced air system. Contemporary building science confirms that people feel more comfortable at lower air temperatures if the surrounding surfaces are warm, a principle he had intuitively understood. His low ceilings and the creation of a warm living envelope near the floor were a practical application of what architects today call a conditioned thermal zone, maximizing comfort while minimizing the volume of space that requires heating. His work was a masterclass in understanding thermal mass, R values, and the principles of a buffered building envelope, all without knowing the formal terms. Ultimately, the story of Lin Jian and his Kong is a parable about the nature of wisdom. The settlers of Pembina County were not foolish men. They were experienced, hard-working, and courageous, relying on a set of traditions that had served them well in other parts of the country. Their failure was a failure of imagination, a cognitive blindness brought on by their own cultural confidence. They saw something that was different, and they reflexively dismissed it as wrong. Lin Jian's triumph was not merely one of superior technology, but of a superior mindset. He was a quiet observer, a humble synthesizer of knowledge, combining the ancient wisdom of his homeland with the practical lessons he learned from the indigenous inhabitants of his new one. He trusted in principles over prejudice, in observation over assumption. In the unforgiving arithmetic of a Dakota winter, where every stick of wood was measured against the relentless cold and every degree of warmth was a victory against death, it was the quiet man with the strange and foolish bed of stone who had solved the equation for survival.